So this is week 7 of this 10-part series. We don't have time to recap the first 6 weeks today, but you can check them out on our website, waikoloacc.org. We're talking about dreaming the dream, finding the dream that God has placed within your heart, the good work that He created you to accomplish, and pursuing that with all the gusto you can. Being able to answer 10 key questions about your dream improves your chances of actually successfully achieving what it is God created you and called you to do with your life. So we've mentioned the shared dream for growing our church in addition to all of our other dreams in life, in every question along the way. But this week, I really want to dial in today's question very specifically with how it applies to our shared dream for building up our church. And it is the cost question. And this question certainly is about paying the price with your time. It's about paying the price to create your dream with your energy and with your talents. But today we especially want to look at what it's going to cost us financially to make all of our dreams a reality. That's true of every single dream in your life, but especially today we're going to be talking about what it will cost each of us with respect to building our church. So here's the big question. Here's the cost question. What are you willing to pay in order to make sure your dream continues to move forward? And as we relate it to our church, what are you willing to pay in order to make sure our shared dream for building our church continues moving forward? So we have a very urgent, yet completely solvable financial situation in our church. And we've actually had that situation for over 9 years. We're not bringing in enough funds to offset the ministry that we're doing. But it's an actually easily overcome, completely solvable situation. All that's required to solve that situation is for all of us to be willing to answer this cost question with a resounding yes. So you're going to hear more about that in the congregational meeting today if you attend, the plan that the council has decided upon to move this thing forward in a positive direction. If your dream is seeing our church grow and thrive as a community of faith that loves people, that disciples people to become fully devoted followers of Jesus, including people who are just 1 day old, all the way up to people who are 120 years old. Ever since the time of Noah, we're not allowed to live any longer than 120, so we're not aiming for 121-year-olds as our demographic, but we are aiming for everybody 1 day old all the way up through the age of 120 years old. All of those ages, all of those people are important for us to be the healthy, growing, thriving, family-focused church that we want to be. So if your dream is to reach all of the unsaved people in our community of all of those different ages by introducing them to Jesus and discipling them into fully devoted followers of Jesus, then you and I have the same dream for our church, because that's my dream for our church. If this is our shared dream, then we have to ask the question, what should our shared response to that information be? And so as we vote on the council's recommended budget for 2020 today at our annual budget meeting, the question we all have to answer is, are we all willing to pay the price for our shared dream of building a growing and thriving church here at Waikoloa Community Church? And my hope and my prayer is that we'll all say yes. Sarah Ben Brethnak says, always remember that sacrifice, striving, and struggle always precede success, even in the dictionary, right? So there isn't a single church in the world that has achieved their dream without paying a price for it. In fact, some Christian movements have cost people their actual human lives. That's been their level of cost. They were actually martyred voluntarily just in order to advance the cause. Nobody's asking you to give your life, right? Others have been paid for with sacrifices of possessions, of sacrifices of relationships. I'll give you an example that's near and dear to my heart. Annette and I uprooted our lives in Ohio. We moved almost 6,000 miles away from every family member and every friend we had in the world at the time to come here and to pursue this dream of building this church with all of you. We only see our daughter once a year. We only see our parents and our siblings and our nieces and nephews once every couple of years. When we came, we gave away most of our possessions. We came here with 6 suitcases and 3 small shipped boxes and about $1,000 to our name, plus what you gave to help supply the move here. That's all we have. That's just a small part of our journey. And that's just a small part of our commitment to continue advancing this dream of Waikoloa Community Church. So the question we're asking today is, what about you? What have you learned about the value of sacrifice when it comes as a necessary step to reaching your dreams, whatever your dreams are, but also specifically today, how it relates to this shared dream of advancing and growing our church. So even though we're zeroing in on our shared dream for our church today, this still applies to every God-given dream that He's placed in your heart to accomplish as well. So, want to go back to school, get another degree? It's going to cost you something. Do you want to have a child or another child? It's going to cost you something. Do you want to get married or do you want to get remarried? It's going to cost you something. Do you want to buy a house? It's going to cost you something. Do you want to travel the world? It's going to cost you something. Do you want to build a new business? That's going to cost you something. Do you want to build a great, growing, and thriving church? It's going to cost all of us something. Every journey toward a dream, even a shared dream, is still deeply personal, and so is the price that must be paid for it. Nobody can tell you what your price should be. That's a conversation you have to have with God and decide what that price is going to be. So let's talk about what has to happen for us to pay the necessary cost of our dream for our church. This is the big focus today. We all need to transition from believer in the dream to buyer of the dream. Let me say that again. We all need to transition from believer in the dream to buyer of the dream. Because dream believers, they can be found in abundance, but dream buyers are rare. It's just like people who say, I believe in the existence of God. That's really easy to do. Compared to people who buy into a lifetime of saying, I'm going to live for God. I'm going to serve that God that I believe in. There's a vast difference between those two positions. This is true for every kind of dream in your life. There is that kind of difference between believing in its possibility and doing what's necessary to bring it to fruition. Some people abandon their dreams. Some people table their dreams when the cost becomes apparent. They just look at it and they say, I don't think I'm ready to pay that kind of cost yet, so I'm just going to put this dream on hold and we'll revisit it at another time. But sometimes people abandon their dream entirely. When they look at it and they say, the cost is more than I anticipated, the cost is more than I'm willing to pay, I'm just walking away from this dream, I'm abandoning it completely. Annette and I, we just watched this great documentary called The Need to Grow. And it's about people who are developing new technologies to improve the quality of our soil in growing fruits and vegetables and other plants and things, right? And here's an amazing fact we didn't know until we watched this. We have an estimated 60 years of farmable soil left on our planet due to unsustainable agricultural practices. In fact, the earth has lost an estimated third of its farmable soil just in the last 40 years. In the U.S., we're losing farmable soil at the rate 10 times greater than it takes to regenerate it. We're running out of nutrients in our soil. You can't feed the world from dead soil. You can't grow food to feed the animals that we eat. You can't grow food to feed the vegetarians and the vegans in the world. You can't do it. We're all going to die if we don't do something about this problem. That was the main thrust of this documentary. So there's some people who are working really hard on their individual dreams to try to solve this problem. There's people who are doing urban farming and micro farming and all these other kinds of things. And one of the stories they told was about a guy named Michael Smith. Here's a picture of Michael Smith. I know our projectors are terrible. We're working on that, but hopefully you can kind of get a vibe for what Michael is like. Michael is an amazing scientist. He's actually a genius. And he was a pioneer of 3D printing. He was a pioneer of 3D animation, of software physics engines that they use in video games to make people look like real people moving in a video game animation. He did all kinds of artificial intelligence work in the early days. He worked with Disney, he worked with NASA, he worked with the FBI, and he actually turned down a job at Lucasfilms with George Lucas, the founder of Star Wars, right? Because it would require him to relocate permanently to San Francisco. And that didn't fit the dream of his life. So he turned down that job with Lucasfilms, and he stayed in his home place of Columbia Falls, Montana, because he decided he wanted to pursue his dream. One of his dreams is to create this amazing invention, and he did it. He created this amazing invention he calls the Green Powerhouse, or the GPH. And the Green Powerhouse heats wood waste without consuming it, and it does so in a closed system. It produces no pollution, and he's growing algae in this greenhouse, and then he recycles the methane gas that the algae produces to reheat the wood in the furnace, and he uses this heat to power the greenhouse, and he grows this food, and he produces enough excess energy from this one structure to power 100 homes. He calls electricity his waste product. It's not really the intent of what they're doing with this. Electricity is what they produce accidentally as a waste product. And they said in the movie it would take 3 acres of solar panels to produce the same amount of electricity as Michael's structure is producing, just this one building. So the main goal of what he's trying to create is not electricity, it's something called biochar. Biochar is a super compact and intricate charcoal that's made up of all these intricate exponential pores. It creates this massive surface area in a very, very small space. And all of this provides an ideal growing matrix for billions of microbes, all the things that are needed in every tablespoon of soil for it to be considered truly healthy soil. So just a 2-inch wide piece of this biochar, if you could unfold it out to its total surface area, it covers the same acreage as a football field. So they take this biochar they're making and they mix it with the algae that we're growing, and it produces this incredibly high nutritious additive to put in your soil, and then rejuvenates the soil. When they put it in deficient soil, it actually rejuvenates that whole soil all around it and makes it even more powerful as a growing agent. So the people in these micro farms that are using this product, this biochar, they're growing these things that would blow your mind. And here's a picture. It's hard to see. It looks like a palm tree. It's actually a kale plant. Right? It's just growing kale, but it's ginormous. Everything he showed in this micro farm is just gigantic. And you think you're living in Jurassic Park when you walk through and you look at the side. Here's a romaine lettuce leaf, and it's this big. And you're like, what? How in the world is that possible? So it's this incredible thing. So Michael has a dream of perfecting this prototype and then seeing these things replicated all around the world. Multiple cities all around the world have these green powerhouses that create electricity, et cetera, et cetera. So one day, it all burned down. The whole thing just burned to the ground. It was a total loss. And they had no clear reason why. The fire department couldn't figure it out. And Michael said there's nothing combustible in there. I don't know how it could have possibly burned the way it burned. They had, suspicions of, maybe sabotage by competitors, by big agriculture or big energy, but nobody knew for sure what had happened. But Michael had started the first one largely with a big grant that he got. No insurance company would cover this experimental structure. So he had no insurance payout. He had no grant now. He had no income source. He had no money. His dream was dead. And he could have just given up, right? He could have just said, well, it's just too late. The dream's gone. We ran out of money. Oh, well. The cost to build it up again from the ground up, to start over from scratch, was considered almost impossible by everybody else involved in his company. Nobody else could believe that it was possible. In fact, several of his key personnel left the company. They stood up and gave a big rousing speech that, hey, we're going to rebuild, we're going to change, we're going to do this, and then a month later they just left the company and Michael was left on his own, right? And so all of these years of building up this system from the ground up, all of that was lost. But then, spoiler alert, by the end of the film, Michael was able to rebuild. It was 4 years later. It took 4 years, but he rebuilt it from scratch, and it's in full operation again. So watching this, it was what an inspiration Michael was to be willing to pay the cost for his dream as many times as necessary, as frequently as necessary, even if the whole thing burns down to the ground a couple of times along the way. See, because here's the difference. I have often listened to people in midlife, which is my age now, right? I turned 56 this year. I'm middle-aged. And so these are people who express regret in their life because they backed off from some dream in their younger years. There was a career that they wish they would have pursued. There was an opportunity they wish they would have seized. There was a relationship they wish they would have fought for. And decades later, as they think about it and start coming back to it, they just, for some of them, they say, well, it's too late. There's nothing I can do about it. I can't achieve that dream at any price. But for others, the dream is still possible. It's just now the price is much, much higher because dreams are like anything else. They're subject to inflation. The earlier we buy in, the earlier we make an investment, the more those rewards are going to come back and compound over time. And if we haven't started paying the cost of our dreams sooner, we can't go back and change time. We can't change what we didn't do, but we do have control over what we're willing to sufficiently underwrite today and moving forward. So that's the first thing we want to talk about today. The second one is this. We need to realize the price will always be higher than we expect. All dreams have a price tag on them. Again, we talked about that. You want to go back to school. You want to have kids. You want to get married. You want to buy a house. You want to travel. You want to do this. It's always higher than you expect. Almost always higher than you expect to pay. Nobody I know in life has ever said, man, reaching my dream was way easier than I expected. I've never heard anybody say that. You never know the complete bottom line cost of your dream up front. You only find out that information as you take the journey. But if you're truly committed to the end vision, to the dream, what we talked about in the early weeks, the ownership question and the clarity question and all those things, if you're really committed, then when those extra costs unexpectedly come your way along the journey, you find a way to pay them. You sacrifice, you sell something, you cut back, you borrow, you do whatever you have to, because the alternative is your dream dies. That's the other option. Paul Hogan, the guy that played Crocodile Dundee in the Crocodile Dundee movies, said, the secret of my success is that I bit off more than I could chew and chewed as fast as I could. Dreams that are worth pursuing simply don't come cheap and they don't come easy. The bigger the dream is, the bigger the price tag is going to be. And the secret is to just keep chewing, to not give up, to keep going. And the third thing we need to talk about is we need to realize the price must be paid more than once. Dreams are a lot like children. There's always ongoing costs involved to raise them to adulthood, even beyond adulthood. For some of you who have adult children, you know what I'm talking about, right? Dreams of successfully growing your dream, and including our dream of a growing and thriving church, that's no exception. We're going to have ongoing monthly costs. We got to keep the water on. We got to keep the lights on. We've got to keep the staff provided for. We've got to keep the building maintained. We've got to keep the missions and the other ministries flowing. That can't be supported by one big once and for all gift. It's going to take all of us who have chosen this as our mutual dream to continually and regularly support the ministry financially. So the question we have to consider is, how will I do that? How will I personally, how is God leading me personally to do that? How will I support this dream of our church financially? And here are some things to consider as you pray about that, as you listen for God's leading in your specific situation, your specific abilities. What's God saying to you? So let's talk about a couple of philosophies of meeting the cost of a dream like that. The first one is priority giving. Scripturally, we also talk about this being known as first fruits giving. One example, there's many examples in Scripture, just one comes from Proverbs 3, which says, honor the Lord with your wealth. Would you say that aloud with me? Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Then, he says, your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. We say, where is that promise coming from? If I honor the Lord with my wealth, with the first fruits of all my crops, the result will be my barns will be filled to overflowing and my vats will brim over with new wine. Well, it's more specific in the book of Micah. God says to test him in this. In fact, it's the only time in all of Scripture that we're commanded by God to test him in the promise that he's making to us. He says over and over again in Scripture, yes, I'm telling you to give. Yes, I'm telling you to give sacrificially. But listen to me, don't miss this. You cannot outgive me. That's God's big picture about giving. The idea behind this kind of stewardship in a church is to make this shared dream a financial priority in our life. This giving priority, the first fruits of our crops, it applies to every dream in your life. If it's really important to you, then it has to take priority. When you've got money to spend, you got to push it towards your dream, or your dream's never going to get off the ground. That's true with a church as well, especially in a shared dream of growing a church. We give God our first fruits of all of our income. We give him our best. We don't give him our leftovers. If we wait until the end of the month to give the leftovers to the church, there's typically no leftovers left to give. So that's a big question to ask. Am I honoring God with my wealth? And so listen, if we're spending more on tipping servers at restaurants when we go out to eat than we are spending on building our shared dream of our church with our tithes and offerings, we have to admit our priorities are out of whack and our dream is in danger of failing. Before we write any other check, before we spend anything, before we ever go do any kind of fun activity, we should make sure that we've supported our shared dream of this church as the first cost of our month, our first offering. Honor the Lord with our wealth. The second philosophy of giving is percentage giving, and this stewardship principle comes from the biblical principles of tithing, which is a word that literally means 10%. Both the Old Testament and the New Testament, Jesus in the New Testament encouraged the people to tithe. You look at Deuteronomy 14:22, and God says, you shall surely tithe all the produce from what you sow, which comes out of the field every year. In other words, you should give 10% of that to God. In Luke, in the New Testament, Jesus is talking about the Pharisees. And he says, woe to you Pharisees, for you pay tithe of mint and rue and every other kind of garden herb, yet you disregard justice and the love of God. And then listen to what Jesus says. These are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. In other words, I'm not telling you shouldn't be tithing. You should be doing that. But you should also be regarding justice properly and the love of God properly. So in context, in the New Testament, when we really read the whole thing, we see this idea of tithing. It's really presented as a minimum level of commitment, actually, to what we're called to do for supporting the ministries of God. Having a lifestyle of generosity, having a lifestyle of sacrificial giving, that's what God's really calling us to do, to assure that our shared dream of growing and thriving a church is accomplished. There are many, many passages about excelling in our generosity, not going to God and saying, okay, what's the bare minimum you want me to give? If that's the wrong attitude. God's saying, no, I want you to be thinking, how can I be generous? How can I excel in my giving? How can I excel in my generosity? So here's just one example. Again, there's many, many passages about this, but here's one. Paul writes to the Corinthian church in 2 Corinthians 8, He says, just as you excel in everything, and he lists a couple of those things, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in your love for us, he says, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. So when we preach about that, when I teach about that over the years, sometimes people say this idea of giving 10% of my income to the local church dream, that just feels too huge to me. So my recommendation is always this: pick some percentage that you do feel comfortable with, whatever it is for you. You look at your income and you say, maybe it's 5%. I could give 5% of my income to support the ministry of the church. Or maybe it's 2%. Or maybe it's 1%. Whatever it is for you, as you pray about it and say, God, what would you have me do? And then as you give, as you trust God to provide for you, to bless your faithfulness, like he said in these other passages, if you honor God with your wealth, your barns will be filled to overflowing, your vats will brim with new wine. If you give, you can't outgive God. All of these things. What you do then is over time you say, oh, I don't even miss that 1%. It's like I never had it. I don't even care about it. I'm going to bump up my giving to 2%. And then maybe a year later you say, you know what? I still feel that way. I'm going to bump it up to 3%. Whatever your system is that you work out with God, that's what you need to do. I'm not going to give you a number. I'm not going to give you a percentage. I will give you an example of a guy, Pastor Rick Warren of Saddleback Church. He's reached a point in his life where he actually is able to practice reverse tithing. He lives on 10% of his income and he gives 90% of his income away. He and his wife, when they first got married, they started by giving 10%, and then the next year they bumped it up to 11, and the next year they bumped it up to 12, and the next year they bumped it up to 13, and they kept doing that. And then he wrote this amazing best-selling book called The Purpose-Driven Life, and he made tens and tens of millions of dollars from that book. And he said, what am I supposed to do with this? And he remembered, honor God with your wealth. So he went back to the church and he figured out every single cost that they had given, his entire salary, all of his benefits, everything that had been paid to him in the entire history of Saddleback Church. And he refunded back all of that money to the church. And now he doesn't take any salary, any benefits at all from the church. He pays his lifestyle 100% his own, and he gives 90% of his book sales and speaking engagement fees away, and then he lives on 10%, all because of this idea that he excelled in this way of giving, a percentage and priority giving. He gave more and more as the Lord continued to bless him with more and more. You can't outgive God. So you make your gift to God through your church, the first thing that you give, and in prayer you let God name the percentage amount that you have the faith to stick with, and then you watch him as he grows your faith and grows your generosity over time. If you don't do something like that, you'll tend to give whatever's left over at the end of the month, and typically nothing is left over at the end of the month, or very little anyway. And then the third principle is sacrificial giving. And this was modeled for us by Jesus and many early disciples. In the New Testament, this basic tithing challenge increased to the idea of sacrificial giving. Give whatever God says, whatever, even if it's everything. If God says, listen, I'm talking to you and I'm telling you give everything away, then say yes and give everything away. That was the challenge given to us in the New Testament. Don't limit ourselves to say, well, I'm giving the tithe or I'm giving the offering. Be willing to give away anything and everything God asks you to give. This is what Jesus did, called his original disciples to do this. I want you to leave your job. I want you to leave your business. I want you to leave your possessions. And I want you to come devote your life to following me. And it's the kind of commitment to the dream that every disciple, including you and me, may be asked of by God. God could come to you or me today and ask us to do that very thing. Give away everything you have and come follow me. The scripture we just read was written by Paul back in 2 Corinthians, and it was given after he gave a different example, this example of sacrificial giving. So from the same chapter, 2 Corinthians 8, just a couple of verses before, he says, in the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. He's talking about an example of sacrificial giving from another church. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability. How can you give beyond your ability? The only way that can happen is if God supplements your giving. If God gives things you didn't even know you had access to, that's the only way you can give more than you're able to give, right? So sacrificial giving. Then perpetual giving is the last part of this philosophy of giving. The cost of a dream goes on and on and on. As long as the dream goes, there's going to be cost. So perpetual and regular giving is necessary to carry on the dream without any gaps, without any downtime, and without any setbacks. The cost of any dream is never a one and done situation. And this is a critical idea for keeping your dream going at a steady and consistent rate 24/7, 365, right? And this is true, again, of any dream you have in your life. I'm not just talking about the church, but I am specifically talking about the church today as well. This is one of the big reasons we're really encouraging people to think about starting to give online. Because here's what happens. We go on vacation, or we're off island for several months a year, or we're sick one Sunday, or we're busy visiting with people one Sunday or one week. Something different is happening in our life, and we don't come to church that week, or maybe for several weeks in a row. And so what typically happens is our monthly giving will fluctuate largely because of that non-regular financial support. If I'm here, I give. If I'm not here, I don't give. And so you never know from month to month what's the giving going to be. Is it going to be enough to cover the costs? But if we sign up to automatically give online on the website on a regular basis, our offering still makes it here on time, and it supports the costs on time that we're incurring on our journey toward reaching this shared dream of a growing and thriving church here in our community. You know, going after a dream is a lot like climbing a mountain. We'll never make it to the summit if we're carrying too much weight. And as we enter each new phase of the climb, as we face each new decision, as we face each new obstacle, we have to say, do I take on more weight to carry, or do I lay down some things that aren't going to help me on the journey to the ultimate destination, or do I just stop climbing altogether and abandon the dream? So the need to keep investing in our dream, again, not just the church, every dream in your life. If you've got a dream that you're pursuing, start a new business, whatever, raise a child, etc., the costs are going to keep coming perpetually. You have to decide, am I on board for this as long as it takes to reach the ultimate dream, or am I going to walk away from it? Am I going to just bail on it? The dream journey only gets to continue. It only gets to keep growing if we continue to pay the necessary price. And the higher we want to go, the more we have to invest, the more we have to sacrifice, the more we have to give in general. That's true of our time, that's true of our energy, that's true of our finances and every other resource, and it's true of every single dream in your life, including the dream of growing this church. You remember we read about the first church in Jerusalem last week, and they believed in their shared dream so much that they sold all of their possessions, and they lived communally to save costs and to ensure that they could provide for everyone in their church who had a need. Now, I'm not asking you to give up all your worldly possessions and wealth to the church and move into a commune with me. I'm not asking you to do that. So if that's what you thought, you can relax. You can be like, whew, okay. What I am asking each of us to do is to prayerfully consider, can I sacrifice a little more? Can I give a little more? Can I serve a little more than I have been? Do I still believe in this dream of growing this church? Is it still our dream? And if it is, then we all have to keep repeatedly, consistently, perpetually paying the necessary prices along the way. So there's a big question. Is it possible to pay too much for a dream? Is it possible to pay too much for a dream? And I think the answer to that question is yes. I think every dream has a God-given wisdom to it. There's an ultimate, correct, maximum price to pay for any dream. For example, no one should have a money pit dream. where you're just constantly pouring money into it and nothing's ever progressing, right? At some point you just have to say, this is not working, this is the wrong dream, God's not blessing it, so it must not be what I'm supposed to be doing, right? Some costs are simply too high. I've seen some people compromise their values for their dreams. I've seen some people sacrifice their marriage for their dream. I've seen people sacrifice their entire families, their entire relationship with their family, ruin their health, go bankrupt, all in pursuit of a dream. I've come close to those things or actually paid some of those things in the past in my pursuit of various dreams over the years. And so I learned the hard way. I'm not going to do that again. If I'm ruining my health or if I'm sacrificing relationships with my family, no dream is worth that. The damage you do to your life, to their lives, some decisions you make that compromise God's values in order to reach that dream, that can lead you to damage your own soul. And so if you no longer believe in a dream for good reason, then it's definitely time to stop paying the cost of the dream and move on to a different dream that you do actually still believe in. And that's true of churches too, right? If you're in a church and you say, I don't believe in this church anymore, I don't believe in this pastor anymore, I don't believe in this dream anymore, then maybe that's time to say, okay, there's some other church, there's some other dream, some other pastor I could believe in and I could give to support. So God's values must govern your dreams. Let me say that again. God's values must govern your dreams. So here's something I would encourage you to do. Make a list of all the things in your life that you say, you know what, I need to protect these things at all costs. I need to make sure I don't sacrifice any of these things ever, not even for the sake of a dream that I have. Make a list like that. What are the non-negotiable things that I cannot sacrifice for any dream? Now, having said that, this list should be a pretty short list. There should only be a handful of things that have that kind of value. And if it's a really, really long list, pretty soon you're not willing to sacrifice anything for your dream. And that makes it impossible to achieve it. So we want to focus on the essentials of life and be willing to give up everything else that God tells us to give up in order to achieve whatever dream it is that He placed in our heart. When He thought about us and dreamed us before He created the foundations of the world, when He created us to do these good works in Christ Jesus that He had chosen us to do, all of those dreams, all of those good works God put in your heart, all of these things apply to all of those dreams, and it applies to our shared dream of this church. If God guides you to give it up, He also guarantees He'll provide a different way for you along the way. That's what the Bible says over and over and over again. So I reduced that down to a couple of principles. Number one, trust that where God guides, God provides. If God tells you to give up something, it means He's going to provide what you need in a different way. Trust that where God guides, God provides. And then second, know that our commitment always precedes God's provision. We've talked several times about how the Israelites were trying to cross the Jordan River, and the priests were carrying the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders, these poles that held the Ark of the Covenant, and they had to get across this flowing river, and they couldn't just walk across, they couldn't swim with this thing, it weighed a ton, and God told them, walk into the river and I'll part the waters for you. But it wasn't until their feet stepped into the water that the waters began to part. Our commitment precedes God's provision. We do an act of faith and we say, Lord, I believe in you, I trust you, I make this choice, I make this sacrifice, I give this gift, I pay this price, whatever, and now that I've made that commitment, boom, that unlocks God's provision. Finally, there are three other costs we need to be prepared to pay when it comes to realizing whatever dream it is that you're pursuing. Number one, you have to pay the cost of persevering through the criticism of others, because that's going to come with any dream you try to pursue. Somebody's going to be there to tell you, you're too old to go back to college, you're too old to have a kid, you're too young to do this, you're too whatever to do. There's always going to be a criticism. You have to pay the cost of persevering through the criticism of others. When you are criticized, when your dream is criticized, remember, Jesus and the original disciples were criticized and laughed at all the time, and so were their dreams. You're in really good company. Think about Jonas Salk, inventor of what we know as the Salk vaccine, right? First, people will tell you that you are wrong, he says. Then they'll tell you that you are right, but what you're doing isn't important. And finally, they'll admit you are right, and what you're doing is very important, but after all, they knew it all the time, right? That's the way it goes. So when should you listen to criticism? Is there ever a time you should listen to criticism? Yes, there's a few things. Number one, when you are unconditionally loved by the one who criticizes you, you should listen. When Annette criticizes me, I listen because I know she unconditionally loves me. And she wouldn't be telling me something that was hard for me to hear unless she really believed it was in my best interest. Number two, when the criticism is not tainted. Your notes say gained. That's a typo. You might write the word tainted above gained. When your criticism is not tainted by that person's personal agenda, right? I just don't like you, and I've got this other thing I want to accomplish, and if I criticize you, maybe I can stop you from doing what you want to do, and I'll get to do what I want to do instead. Don't listen to that. When the person criticizing you is not naturally critical of most things. Sometimes there's just people who are critical spirit people. They just love to criticize and be negative about everything. You don't want to listen to them. When the person will continue giving support to you even after the criticism has been shared, that's somebody you should listen to, right? I don't see it the same way you do, but I trust you and I'm willing to follow you on this. I'll help you. I'll help support this, even though it's not really the way I would approach it. I'm going to continue to support you, but I just wanted you to know that I think there's another way we could be looking at this, right? Listen to that kind of criticism. And then finally, when the person has great experience or great knowledge about the area being criticized, right? If I'm out teaching something about medicine and a nurse or a doctor comes up and says, actually what you're teaching is not true, here's what's really the deal, that's criticism I should accept and take and respond to, right? Proverbs says, the wounds of a friend are faithful, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. In other words, you want to accept constructive criticism from the people you know love you, and that's better than a false friend building you up and puffing you up and telling you good things. The second thing we need to be prepared to pay, the second cost, is pay the cost of overcoming your irrational fears, right? Fear and self-limited thinking can completely defeat any possibility for a dream. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of looking foolish, even the fear of success sometimes. Oh, what happens if this works? Am I smart enough to take it to the next level? That kind of holds us back sometimes. What will I do if this works? Will I be able to sustain it? Can all of those things can sabotage you? All those things can sabotage our church, right? Of course, not all fear is bad. Some fear is rational fear. It protects us. It warns us of danger. When fear is irrational or disproportionate to the risk of the threat, that's when it can harm us, and that's when it can destroy our dreams. And then we need to pay the cost of sweat equity. If you want to lose 180 pounds, you're going to have to work really hard. You're going to have to take a lot of steps. You're going to have to sweat a lot of sweat. Any dream worth having requires hard work. If we aren't willing to work for it, we're never going to achieve it. For us to achieve our mutual dream of creating a growing and thriving church that again consists of people 1 day old all the way up to people 120 years old, we all have to be willing to work hard at that. We have to work hard. We can't just keep doing whatever's easiest and still realize our mutual dream. It's going to take a lot of courage to let go of some things we love, to let go of some good things so that we can do the great things. It's going to take a lot of commitment. It's going to take a lot of work to pay the price for our dream. And even if we do pay all of these prices for our dreams, even if we pay the cost, we answer this cost question, yes, 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 there are no guarantees that we will reach the exact dream we were aiming for. However, I can give you this guarantee. If we don't pay the cost of our dream, we will absolutely not reach our dream. If we give it everything we can, There's no telling what can be achieved. If we pay the cost for a dream that will outlive us and touch other lives for many years to come, that's the ultimate payoff. There's an old Greek proverb that says, "A society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they will never sit." In other words, make part of your dream something that's going to live on beyond you and bless generations after you are long gone. So here's our homework. We give you homework at the end of each of these messages. Today's is a little shorter. How much am I willing to pay? That's the question. How much am I willing to pay? This is in finances, in sweat, in time, in other kinds of sacrifice. How much am I willing to pay in order to help Waikoloa Community Church achieve our shared dream of growing this thriving church? How much am I willing to pay? And then the second question is, how much am I willing to pay? Again, in finances, in sweat, in time, and sacrifice to achieve my other dreams in my life. If my dream is go back to school and get this other degree, if my dream is move to this other town or buy this house or build this family thing or build a business, etc., whatever the dream is God put in your heart, you need to be able to answer this cost question. How much am I willing to give to that? How much am I willing to pay to make that happen? Because if it's not very much, then the odds are you're probably not going to reach that dream. So we've covered 7 of the 10 questions that we need to be able to answer yes to if we're going to be able to see and seize whatever that God-given dream is that He's placed inside of our heart. And He's told us, if you will give, I'm going to give even more than you give. Whatever you put into your dream, I'm going to put more into your dream. But your commitment is going to precede my provision. And wherever I guide you, I am going to provide for you. You can bet on that. He's placed that in your heart. If you're going to accomplish the good works in Jesus Christ God designed you for and built you to accomplish for Him and for His glory, you've got to be able to answer yes to these questions. So we've got another question next week. We're going to hit question number 8, which is the tenacity question. And that question is, am I moving closer to my dream? Am I moving closer to my dream? Am I making progress along the way? Let's pray together. God, touch each heart here today. Help us focus in on the cost of all of our dreams, whatever those dreams are, individual or mutual, including our shared dream for this church, Lord. Just touch each of our hearts, speak to each of us individually, and tell us what it is that each of us should give. What are you calling us to give? What cost are you calling us to pay in order to move the dream of our church and our other dreams forward? Help us each have that answer, and help us answer your request with a resounding yes. That's my prayer for all of us today. In Jesus' name, amen.